Welcome into the Catholic Family Podcast. I am your host, Kevin Davis, and today I am joined and live streaming also with the Modern Monarchist. And I guess you could probably guess what our topic is going to be about today. It's going to be again political. I know for my listeners and viewers, everyone's kind of like, oh, Kevin, all this political stuff. So again, if you don't want to listen to the political stuff, there's plenty of other material over on the channel. We publish material covering the lives of the saints. We have a lot of Lenten meditations from around the world, Catholics recording from India, from Australia, from the US, of course. And there are also some shows that cover politics, some shows that cover religion. We cover a bunch of different things. And so please, if you don't like politics, go check those out. That's totally no problem. And I hope you don't have a problem with us covering this topic as well. The topic is going to be political action, Catholics being involved in politics. Is it important, or is it something that we should stay away from? And we're going to talk a little bit about a subject that sounds a bit like a bad word, and that's nationalism. And so I'm going to send it over to you, maybe a brief introduction of who you are, and we'll get running.
All right. Well, I'm the Modern Monarchist. I'm using a pseudonym. I've had that for years. I just thought it was good because it's an alliterative, And so I've been running with this. I am a sedevacantist. I was born a sedevacantist, and I have, proudly been a Catholic my whole life. And when you said, not talking about politics sometimes is good. Well, the way I like to think of it, Kevin, is whatever brings a horse to water, I think is a good thing. And there's a lot of politically minded young men out there who aren't Catholic. And once they discover Catholic social teachings, they start to even think of the faith as something more than just, oh, I know a guy that's Catholic. They want to start going there themselves because they're politically minded. They want success in politics, and they're not going to get that with a Republican or Democrat Party 2022, which is seems to be like the only paradigm in America. So thank you actually for having a big host of issues for people to listen to and videos to listen to. But that's what I am. I'm involved in a nationalist group. Yes, dirty word, nationalist, but we are a Catholic nationalist group, America First, and our leader is Nick Fuentes. And we've been working to become more Christian and truly more Catholic. And I use Christian in the broad sense because it is a coalition. America, sadly, is a Protestant nation. But with this movement, we're working to become always better because the spirit of reform is constant. And without a big picture view, we will be waiting to die like old men with gray beards if we're waiting for a perfect political movement. So that's why I'm involved. And I'll see if you have any questions for me, Kevin, on how you want to start this.
No, I think that I first of all want to say I don't honestly know that much about the movement. I'm not affiliated with the movement. Catholic Family Podcast is not necessarily promoting the movement, but again, I think it's important to have these conversations. It's important to talk about being active in politics and in society because we do live in this world, and it is a good question. Do we let the world burn around us, or do we try, at least in some way, to affect it, and do we try to be politically minded? And it's a controversial topic, and I think that it does depend on the person. It depends on the party. And as you say, if you look at the two-party system in America, it's been broken probably since its founding. I mean, maybe in some cases you've had some good outcomes or decent outcomes, but there's plenty to pick that's wrong with it when you have two 80-plus-year-old men running, and one of them is senile, and the other one at least has his issues. I think that is a problem, and it's a mega party that runs with two different names. I mean, in my opinion, with maybe slightly different, platforms, but generally they have the same big government, big spending agenda. And so yes. I think the good place to start is obviously nationalism, because again, when people think of nationalism, we both know they think about Hitler, they think about Mussolini, they think about, okay, you're a racist, you don't want anybody, you only want America, you hate everyone else. It's the truth, and I'm sure you know that better than anybody. So maybe you can tell my listeners and yours, how is that wrong? What are the misconceptions about at least your form of nationalism?
Yes, before I get into that, you did mention like if Catholics should get involved. And I would say, under my opinion, a proper society is one that is a church and state united with a Catholic leader, working with a true pope. However, because since Thomas Jefferson and the founders were deists who believed God was absent after creating the world, he spoke to even the most radical Protestant and Enlightenment thinkers at the time, and they were shocked by what he said because he said he wanted to put up a wall between church and state. And that is what effectively has been put in place. Since there is a wall there, and if we were to engage in taking down that wall, it would be illegal. The thing we could do as Catholics and Christians is to send virtuous men into public office. Because since there is no church trying to influence the state anymore, we need to have virtuous men in order to have a good society. Or else, in my opinion, you should just talk to your friends about the world ending all the time and be sad about it. Get involved if you can because the church has been locked outside the door. It is our job to bring it in. So that's my little prelude there on that.
And what would you say real quick to someone who would say that in order to be successful in politics, you have to pretty much sell your soul?
I would
I know
disagree.
that's extreme, but that's what people would say, right? That would be the argument that if you want to succeed,
Mhm.
you cannot succeed as a good man. You think that's true or no?
I would disagree. I think morally virtuous men will not be blackmailed. And yeah, they could threaten a family member, they could threaten those you love, but that is why it is a very serious position. It's not something you do willy nilly. And most people, when you do think of politics, they think of national, they think of Trump, they think of Biden. But in reality, what affects your life to the smallest level is local and county and state, whether that's the state, you know what I mean? It's a local government. It's not the national one. They decide about the taxing, the schooling, the corona lockdowns, whatever way you swing in that argument. But they decide on that. And that is why you're not going to get blackmailed. You're not going to have to sell your soul if you're doing local. I'm going to run for local, and in fact, I am. But you don't have to, in fact, because there's not that much money, there's not that much interest, there's not these overarching, uh, almost demonical figures posing in, making their way the only way. So I would say if you're a Catholic, pray for the national scene, the national level, but definitely get involved in the local and county because, you know, as Catholics, I've heard on average, as traditional Catholics, we're having an average of 8 children per family, and that's a beautiful thing, a very beautiful thing. So when you start to have big families, you start to have that part of the population becomes more Catholic and thinking more like you, which is a good thing. And our enemies would want us to say it's a bad thing. You need to be more disparate. You need to be all believing in different ideas, but you all believe the same. Therefore, you should be electing and putting forward good men into office, or else you're going to be getting those that don't believe in your values and are anti-Catholic even in a large Catholic area, or at least an area that has a lot of strong, good moral people. So I lost focus on where I was supposed to go with this. Was it on
No, no,
what my
it's good.
nationalism is?
No, I think I kind of skipped over this topic, so I'm glad you brought it back because I think
Mhm.
it's extremely important, and I think that I like talking about that because I hear different complaints about it. I think some people think, for instance, that they are not qualified. That I didn't study civics, or
Mhm.
I don't know enough to be involved with this. I mean, and my answer would be, well, I mean, Donald Trump was president for 4 years. I mean, so I think that that's again, I think that's a bit of a misconception. Is that right?
It is. I mean, you can't be as naive and simple like a Mr. Smith goes to Washington. You can't go like Jimmy Stewart up there. You're going to get chopped up and eaten by the wolves and the sharks. You do need to be smart. And the whole point of politics is not everyone has to run. It's just supporting the right people and encouraging the ones that are capable of doing it to do it. And you support them obviously with prayers because I believe Sola the Apostolate, which every politically minded person should read, not just priests. It says that 20 prayers is more important than than 20 priests in the field or even machine guns. And that's where a lot of well, that might be solely apostolate. That might be surrender to divine will as well. But regardless, one of those two books says that you need to have people praying. So that's like the reinforcements. But you also need people doing like rosary walks and prayer walks against any form of indecency, outside of these terrible abortion clinics, or to promote traditional marriage and traditional birth, all of these things that we need to be focused on as Catholics. Because as a Catholic, and even why I use the word nationalist or monarchical, I use it because I'm a studier of history. I love history, and I see the movements that have been able to have a broad effect on people of our faith. And those are movements that actually say, yes, you are Catholic. You make up a majority in this area. Your belief system is objectively right. You should be leading the nation, because while we cannot create a utopia here on earth, we can create an atmosphere that will lead to the most souls possible getting to heaven. Whereas the current landscape we live in now is like riddled and pockmarked with every form of vice and sin. And just saying we can be fiscal conservatives in public and only remain social in the home, I believe is a lie. And like, they're telling you to put your hands behind your backs and then allowed yourself to get hit and only talk about capitalism and rah like it's still the 1940s in America. So that's why I endorse or follow more along these movements. And I will talk about the nationalism that failed. The nationalism that did fail stretches back to the 1300s, between the wars of England and France, where they didn't have national identities truly yet. The Norman kings spoke French. Gascony in southern France wanted to be with the English because they liked them better. So it was a war really between two kings. And when they started putting their nations, though, however, England and the idea of a France above the idea of a king, you got such evils such as de Nogaret, a chancellor, influencing King Philip to bring the Pope to France. You had the English king seeing this and starting to get the idea of being anti-Pope already in their minds. So whereas when Henry VIII came around, yes, he probably would have done with his sin anyway, any way he wanted to. But it was because the English were becoming anti-Pope for a while, anti-church and more national church, they broke more easily. And of course, those luscious monasteries full of gold, too. That's quite a problem. So nationalism was a bad effect there, but it also rallied the Russians against the Mongols. And the Russians and Eastern Europeans saved Europe from the Mongols, who Western Europe at the time was not centralized and lacked a bigger population like Russia had. And I could go through every list of negative and positive nationalistic movements if you want. But do you want me to touch on the big ones like Hitler, Mussolini?
Oh, let's real quick. I think it's important to what is the definition of nationalism? I suppose. I mean, is nationalism saying that? I mean, is it saying one culture should
Mhm.
be united? I suppose, or is it
Yes.
one? Because what is a country? I suppose. I mean, that's ultimately
Mhm.
the question. Is
I,
it
I can
regional,
I can
societal,
I can
cultural?
talk about that. Like, yeah, everything is a breakdown. It's almost like it's stacked, like there is the local, there is the county, there's all that. But those are just words. In my opinion, there are people, languages, and faith. I said that backwards. There's faith, language, then people. Very simply is this, and I don't think anyone, whether they are white, black, Asian, Hispanic, or whatever, I think they could all agree on this fact that uh, people have the right to exist in their homelands. And in their homelands where they grew up in, I know a lot of people say, well, the Germans were from Central Asia and BC. No, 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 no. The Germans have been living in that part of the world, whether they're Austrian, Bavarian, or Swabian, whatever. They've been living in that part of the world for a long time. Italians have been in the boot for a while. The Anglos have been in that area. They have the right to exist and to have their language persist, their people persist. And where that starts getting attacked, where they start attacking the faith and then the people and then the language, and they want to make it all just one big polyglotted mess, No one benefits. The immigrants, or whether some people say refugees, or even more people, extreme would say invaders, and then the people on the other hand, those that already live there. No one benefits from it because there's distrust. And that's not calling for a 100% ethnic state, because that's what people like Hitler called. They called for that, when in reality, a lot of Germans, as many people know, are not old blonde hair, blue-eyed. That doesn't exist. And so that was a not even an extreme, it's just wrong. Because Hitler was building a political movement off of Enlightenment thinking as well. If he was Catholic, he would have had a state religion, not some quasi pagan thing or ritual, and just giving homage to these broad sentiments of Christianity. So when you say nationalism, and I just went off on a long thing when you told me to keep it simple, Wikipedia answer.
No, it's good.
I will say this, nationalist is a mentality. It's really like a belief in which you want the makeup of your nation to be a certain this, a certain that. It can be bad when you say the certain this and certain that should be genocidal, and when it should just be one thing. Because obviously the nations of the medieval ages, they were pretty much the same thing, but there were a lot of traveling going through them. But they were also a lot less crime-ridden, and they had a lot more culture and focus as a people than many of these polyglotted messes do now. So as a nationalist, I will sum it up as this. As a Catholic nationalist, in my opinion, it is, people have the right to exist, in their own homelands. And that's just that. And you should look after the people that live near to you, more so than even somewhere across the globe, because you do have a common affinity with a person near you. The one binding thing that I love about the Catholic faith in political matters, it has the power to bind people all across the globe together. All across the globe. But there still remains those very real things of language and race even. And so you have to respect language and race, regardless of any sort of political machination. Everyone has the right to exist, Somalis in Somalia, Chinese in Chinese. I often say this. If an Englishman was born in China, let's say, the Chinese wouldn't treat him like an Englishman. I mean, they wouldn't treat him like a Chinese. They really wouldn't. That was the case when the takeover of Hong Kong happened. Everyone knew what was coming for English people. So there needs to be a respect and a respect for people, regardless of their race and religion, to exist in their homelands and to treat each other like we all have a soul. It's very hard for people to do and focus on, because we're all fallible. And people want to say, no, humans come first before religion. But as Catholics, I believe we can lead nationalism and peoples to happy outcomes. And that's not just a business pitch. That's been tried and proven in places such as Europe, such as in South America before revolutions, communist revolutions swept them across. And I think it can work. And if I gave a lot to digest there, I can always take a surgical knife and fork to it and make it a lot easier.
So, I like what you're saying, that, I know part of what the church, again, I don't know if they condemned it, but I know that they strongly disliked nationalism. But the main reason, this was back in the 1950s. We did a show about this, actually. I forget what it was called. A couple months ago. I'll link it to this podcast. But I know the biggest issue was that form of nationalism the church was talking about was when one nation considered itself greater than the others, and thus oftentimes, they invaded others. They took themselves as being the best, and then tried to put their beliefs or their system or whatever onto their neighbors or onto other countries. And I think America has been one of the worst examples of this throughout the last 100 years or so. And I think that is a biggest issue. And so I think when you say that, it means that each country has its own. But
I would argue that America in the past 100 years hasn't even been operating from a nationalist point of view. It's been operating as a globalist hegemonic bully, if you will. And I say that as an American who loves America, but my love of America isn't for the politicians. It even isn't for the laws. We have to respect the laws, but it's for the people, it's for the language, and it's for the history, and especially what we were even as a flawed nation, because America was built off of Enlightenment values, very sadly. But I still have a love for people like Davy Crockett, like Daniel Boone, like even a debatable figure again, Andrew Jackson. These leaders that were able to win battles and contests against these powerful states like the English.
But that's not necessarily because they were American, right? I mean, you also have love
No.
for Joan of Arc and for
Oh yeah.
Charlemagne, for example. So I mean, I don't think you necessarily have to love something because it is from your country. I think you said it really well before that primarily we share our faith with those from around the world, and so that's
Yes.
what we primarily have in common first. And so if that's the case, let's say someone from Ukraine. That's a bad example because that they're seeking asylum. Let's say someone from Nigeria is seeking to move to America, and they
Yes.
have the same faith. Let's say they're Catholic, they're Sede Vacantes, they're traditional Catholics, but they don't have the same race and they don't have the same culture and they don't have the same language.
Mm-hmm.
Is their faith enough to overcome the other obstacles, or do you say, and let's say that they're moving there because there's no mass in Nigeria. There are some, thank goodness, but let's say there wouldn't be. Is that
Yes.
enough reason for them to move for their faith, even though politically or nationally there are other differences, I should say. I don't mean issues.
Yeah.
I mean, there are differences.
I would say this could be a controversial take, but I would say this, that in normal times, and in normal times I mean at times that aren't, where there aren't so much violence, where there isn't so much violence based on race as there is right now. Because in America, I think everyone agrees, left or right, that there's a huge problem with race. And it really is true. Like, there is a lot of racial violence, and we're going to see how it all plays out. I don't think even the smartest people truly know what the future holds. But in a normal time, if the country was on its legs, I would say absolutely and yes, and it would actually be encouraged. But right now, and I agree, if this is a little too controversial, I won't dig too deeply into it. But right now, there is a lot of anti-European sentiment going on in this country. Anti-European descent, anti-white, whatever you want to call it. And sadly, a lot of other races can get pulled into that, even though they share the same faith. And I've met it personally in my adventures, if you will, into politics. I just think that currently, right now, the mindset is that you can't have Western civilization without the people who built it. And the people who built Western civilization, they were Catholics, they were Christians, but they also came from Europe as well. And I've yet to see a replication of Western civilization in another continent outside of North America or Australia that has really succeeded in replicating Western civilization. So it would need to be under right times. And like, obviously, one person's not going to affect the demographic makeup of a country. And it's not nothing to be like, we're going to watch the docks and the plane stations, train stations, and be like, no, one person, no. But when it starts to be a swarm or a large group, it tends to overpower the makeup of an area. And I think that's even detrimental to relations of charity, because you want to be around people that sound like you, talk like you. Worship is the most important. But time and time again, history has failed to give us a moment where people of disparate natures and customs can work together in a utopia. It always and sadly resorts in blood violence, as Africa has proven.
And it's a really good point. I mean, I live in Germany, and fortunately in Bavaria, this is not as much of an issue, but in other cities especially, there is a certain ethnic group of people with a certain religion that is, let's say, to the east, and they don't assimilate. Not all of them. This is obviously generalizing. Some of them do, but they don't assimilate. They don't try. They don't change their religion. They don't change their language. They don't change their dress. And they don't like our laws. I mean, the extreme is and this sounds crazy, but it's true, and I've seen it. I live here, and they have in sections of Europe taken over entire cities. Really, at least very big chunks of cities. Paris
Yeah.
is barely even Paris anymore. I've been there. I've seen it. It's a
Mhm.
beautiful city that was. I mean, it's decadent as it's a crazy city, but it was once beautiful. And honestly, I would be scared to go there now. And I'm a
Yeah.
pretty strong guide, and I'm not scared of much. But Paris, I don't know if I'd go back. And that's a sad thing. And as you say, you do see it collapse, and it sounds racist because that's what they want. They want it to sound like you're saying we hate these people and we're better than them, and that's not the point. The point is you're mixing two groups of people with completely different lifestyles and
Yeah.
beliefs. And as you say, it can't end well. I mean, it's just even
Mhm.
just common sense should tell us that.
That's why I basically say there is there poses the question, like, will Paris even cease to be Paris if the people there aren't Parisian? And I tend to say no. I mean, you need that's what I mean, like, you need to have a majority of people, because we know the history of Europe. We know about tours. We know about what happened to the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines. Heck, we know what happened to those beautiful Christian countries like Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Hungary that stood up against the Ottoman Empire, and Europe didn't help them, and they got subsumed and put under the yoke of the Ottomans for 500 years, just about, many of them. And so they'll be the first ones to tell you that in your own area, you need to have a common people. That's nothing too hard to ask for. It doesn't mean that there needs to be Nuremberg rallies and book burnings and this insane that isn't just, mind you, it's not just Hitler. There's other leaders like this too. You don't need to have that. You just have to respect the right for people to exist in their own place. And Europe, sadly, has been beaten over the head with the stick of Hitler, that they are so afraid to even say, oh, we just want to exist in our countries, that I'm of the mind that places like Sweden and places like Belgium will even cease to have those ethnicities we've known for hundreds of years. And it's just their approach to families not having children due to impurity, really. They approach that and say, "Oh, you just need to be replaced by people who are just like you. They're just like the Vikings. They're just like, they're the Belgians. They're like all of this." And they fail to realize, or perhaps they don't, but the majority of the people in those countries fail to realize that their ancestry and their history is from a certain place and time, is soaked in 1,000 years or more of Catholic sentiment and thought, and that their area, like the atmosphere, the culture, their geographic location, has a part to play in that too. They just throw it all aside into the winds of modernism. And sadly, that's another thing modernism has affected. Not only our most one and holy Catholic faith, but also the idea that just people should exist in their own places, that there are distinctions between categories of the mind and categories of reality. And modernism says no, it's all about money and pleasure, and what feels good, tastes good is right. And those nations that are falling away are going to fall away, in my opinion. Whereas a nation like Poland, and I visited Poland last year for a month, Slovakia and Poland, those are nations where Slovakia has yet to build one single mosque in their country. And Poland has a very, what I would call a Catholic nationalist sort of political movement. And if you guys like Poland and you see the beautiful pictures of Polish families with Polish flags and rosaries, that's what it is. They subject their people to Our Lady and God, and they say, yes, Polish people are safer because there are Polish here, just Polish. And we are not being charitable. We're protecting our people, and we're trying to be the best Catholics that we can. Sadly, Vatican II has strangleholded their nation, but that is a good idea for modern day Catholic nationalism.
And it's a good point that I think that so much of what we see, you say modernism, that's absolutely true. I mean, modernism is so much the root or the synthesis of all errors, as St.
Mhm.
Pius X would say. And I think that globalism is really a big part of that. And I think that it's another one of those words that comes off as not even icky, but it's conspiracy theory. Like, people hear globalism, they're like, oh yeah, someone's here at the top, ruin. It's like, I mean, maybe, that may be true, but when I look again, I live in Germany and I've been here since 2015 now, and so I've been here for a large part of the migration crisis. It's a crisis, guys. I mean, and so whatever you think about migration, et cetera, they have done such an epically bad job of it in just allowing everyone in without paperwork and without anything, without a plan, without housing, et cetera.
Yes.
And that's just one example. I mean, when you look at that, when you look at the German people no longer having kids, I can't help but think it's a plan. I mean, maybe it's only the devil. It's probably the devil working with different other people. And the plan is, I think you're absolutely right. It is to end these nation states that have Christian values, even if they're distant, even if they've long been buried. Like Germany has Christian values. It was a long Catholic country, and the devil has to rid the world of that so that he can, achieve his ultimate victory. Or he will not win. I shouldn't say that, but he will achieve a victory, that will, send us into the end of the world, I suppose.
You brought up a good point there. Thanks for mentioning that, because the devil not only wants our spiritual damnation as well, but he wants our bodies in hell too. And I think, he's all like, God is all good, but the devil is all evil. And when it comes to, I think, the reason why the powers that be, if you will, hate Europe and the idea of a strong Europe or a unified Europe, it's another way for them to attack God and Christ. I'm not saying that they're equal. All I'm saying is this: Europe and Europeans have been the ones who spread the faith around the world. While the faith may have started in the Middle East, sadly, those churches either fell into heresy, became small, or got overrun by Muslims, or all three. So it was Europe that spread the faith everywhere. So there is a certain vendetta against the Europeans who went around the globe, whether they're the Spanish, the French, or even the English Protestants. They always had some form of religious presence there, and especially the Catholics, as we are Catholic. There would be a priest that would land with the conquistadors. They would overturn the Spanish idols. They would take care of these pagan rituals and rites. So they kind of like to add up and say, oh, the faith is Europe and Europe is the faith. Hilaire Belloc said that in the 1900s. While that may not exist anymore, in the minds of enemies who have hated the faith for so long, they say, Europe, it's kind of a problem that you guys were Christian. It's time we teach you a lesson by hopefully your faith is gone and you don't exist anymore. I think that's kind of why there is so much anti-white, as they say, which is just anti-European sentiment and hatred, is chiefly for the faith. And so they use that as a disguise. They use that as a disguise to attack the flag bearers, the cross bearers. And it's working. It works. And I think it's going to continue to work unless you finally say, hey, I reject your language. I reject your 2000s, 1900s made up words of these, you can oftentimes tell they're like social justice words, right? They're like inclusiveness, race realism. Let's talk about race. I reject that completely. And I think as Catholics, we need to as well. Because it all it does is just it turns you into a self-hating person. It's like, you shouldn't hate the body you're born with, the skin you have. I mean, I can't tan. I don't hate that. I just get red as a tomato in the sun. So it doesn't bother me. And that's how I think it should be thought of, at least. Stop hating yourself.
And so I guess ultimately, I'm trying to think of, do we want to go into the past or into the future? I mean, I think that we'll end with the idea of why it's good to get involved and where we can go. What's the answer? But I think we should. I think if you would describe why your form of nationalism is not the form of Hitler's nationalism, because I think that's the most important. Maybe Mussolini as well, and maybe you can talk about Spain. I think those three are good ones to talk about, especially in Germany, because that's the one that people always hear, the nationalist socialist movement.
Well, First of all, it's not socialist, and again, socialist is a dirty word. I don't like socialism, but it is a dirty word. Capitalism, in many circles, is a word that is oftentimes more prized than God. I want more of a Catholic distributist, but before we have an economic talk, uh, I'll basically say that first of all, the movement isn't about driving out or destroying multi-ethnic groups in America. It's not about that. It's not about putting them as second-class citizens. All it says is that as even Europeans, as even mixed Europeans, as many people in the movement are, like they call us white supremacists, yet our leader is a Hispanic, Italian, Irish, all of those mixtures. So all we want is just a celebration and an enshrinement of our culture that built the country, because it wasn't a country before Europeans came here. And we want the right to exist happily, peaceful, and free with representation in this country. Not one where you go to school and you get attacked for your skin color. Not one where you're saying, oh, you're white, you don't have an opinion to anything. You've always been conquerors. We want equal footing with everyone else, because everyone else is always saying they want equal footing. But I think we've seen for the past 20 to 30 years, the fist has been over white people more than anyone else. And I said so why is because of that Catholic and Christian heritage that we have. So it's just the right to exist in your own nation. There's nothing more about driving out disparate groups.
And so why is it then that why not change the name to something other than nationalism? That again, it smacks of Nazism. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think it should, and I mean, I really don't. I think it's a very different
Yeah.
thing, but it's still a word that has negative connotations to most people.
It's true, and I just don't think we should use. We shouldn't change our words because our enemies don't like them. Because I don't believe what is popular is right, and as Catholics, we shouldn't just follow something because it's popular and follow something because a lot of people think it. I think if we were to do that, like trad Catholics, that's a dirty word for other Catholics. Say, oh, you're probably a rabid anti-Semite. You're probably a rabid, you don't like to go to, you hate other religions and all of that. I think that we should use it because all I'm saying is that nationalism is just the word in which we use when we talk about the makeup of what the makeup of a nation should be. Nationalism is the word. What is the content is what the movement is. That's what the content is. So if the movement is Catholic, then the people of the movement are going to be good. The people of the movement are going to be good. Whereas you look at the National Socialists, they had problems and they just used the word nationalist. But they just used it. It's a blanket statement. It's very ambiguous. It's like liberty. It's like justice. It's like monarchy. They're just words, folks. They're just words. A monarchy can be bad and good. A nationalist leader can be bad or good. Although, let me just say this. Since God is all order and God is not chaos, something that is always more orderly is preferable or preferred to something that is more anarchic and chaotic. So I see no shame in using that word. I just see we have to fight the propaganda machine that tries to rope in all nationalists as Nazis, all people that have problems with capitalism as socialists or communists, and all traditional Catholics as anti-Semite or anti, all the antis, anti-religion. You don't like other religions. You're bigoted. Don't use
But
their language.
does your movement have do you have an issue with capitalism, or is that you personally?
The movement is critical of capitalism because it has the Catholic approach that, an economic idea shouldn't be free of God's law. And it's as simple as that. It needs to bend itself to the Ten Commandments. It shouldn't allow disgusting things to be just to own the internet and to own billboards and signs and everything. That shouldn't have the right of a business scheme, of a platform. That's all it is. And I think hundreds and hundreds of years of church teaching would agree. I mean, St. Louis burned bad books all the time. He chopped off the tongues of blasphemers, so I hear, or branded them. So I wouldn't have a problem with saying that there are flaws in a capitalist society as it stands
Yeah,
now.
I agree. I mean, I think it's another really good show we had on Saturday, talking about the fall of society. Society falls if you lose God. I mean, and it's we went through historical precedents of that being the case, and I think that it's something that's a really important topic, and it's something that I think most Americans just don't understand and don't even
Mhm.
think about, because Americans do have that deep seated patriotism or love of America, which is a good thing. I
Mhm.
truly believe it. I love Americans
Yes.
for it. Germans are exactly the opposite. Germans hate themselves because they've been taught
Yes.
their whole lives to hate themselves, and it's not nice. And I think that there are good things about Americans in Americanism, I suppose, but there are some very bad things too. As you said, it was
Mm.
founded on some very deep errors, and liberalism, as we talked about on the show on Saturday, is an error. It does not fit Catholicism,
It's a mental
and
disorder.
it's yeah, and it's something that's built on the idea again of building an entire country on the freedom of religion and of speech and all these things. It doesn't work with Catholicism,
Yes.
and we are not taught that, and I mean, I'm sure maybe in Catholic schools, but in obviously in public schools, of course not. You're taught to, as you mentioned earlier, to worship democracy and to worship capitalism
Yes.
because it's American and because it's not communism. Now,
Mhm.
I think we both agree that communism is also evil and is condemned by the church, but that doesn't mean that capitalism is the one and only answer. And I think that's something that,
Mhm.
that we really easily fall into. And I've been recently reading an encyclical by Pope Leo the 13th called Libertas. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And it's pretty heavy, so I'm very slowly reading through it. We're going to have a podcast about that in the future, but it
Wonderful.
discusses the issues with liberalism, and I think that it's an interesting point, and I think it's interesting that there's a group trying to solve that issue. So I guess I would ask you then. I mean, as we both know, nationally, there's been a system for hundreds of years. So do you think it's in the realm of realism to believe that you will, in our lifetimes, affect anything on the national scale?
Yes. And I use this metaphor. We are planting the acorn, knowing full well that we will not be able to enjoy the shade, but hope that our children and their descendants will. Because we are living in a world that is, many people would like to say, we are entering the apocalypse. I would disagree with that. And if you want to talk about that another time, St. Vincent Fair thought the world was ending at one point. I think that we need to prepare for the future, because if we don't, there is a despairing sort of atmosphere that tends to cling, yes, to traditional Catholics who prepare for the end and yet do not get involved with anything around them. And that's very bad for humans who have, yes, faith, hope, and charity, but that hope part tends to be in small demand. So, yes, there is a way that things will turn around, and you know how you do it. Going back to the beginning of the show, is local and regional first. Always focus on that first. Help out a good candidate. We had two traditional Catholics run in my area, and they lost due to the slurs of the media and to other Protestants who were our allies and then backed away because they do not share the same social values as we do. But they're getting bolder. We're getting bolder. And we're doing it. A lot of my friends are doing it. We're traditional Catholics of various stripes. And it's good for men, because men were built to be warriors and protectors. And when we feel like we can't protect or fight over anything, it's like you're just as useless as, a woman is in combat, or a man is in the kitchen for the most part. It's like you're not doing your proper role. So get out there. Doesn't mean you have to be a Republican Party shill or anything. Just go out there, speak and preach your faith, and try to turn around your regional area. Or else, you're going to say, how did it come to this? It's like from that Two Towers, Lord of the Rings, right? King Theoden is like, how did it come to this? Well, it's like, well, it came to this by falling asleep on the chair, by falling asleep at the wheel, and praying for God to come down with a lightning bolt and strike all the evil down. I think God wants us to act like everything depends on us and pray as though everything depends on Him. We need to have that action in us. And if I can just help out a little bit in that way, so you don't have to agree with everything we do. as a nationalist movement, but just fight for social values, fight for, strong, good Catholic men to lead the charge against the forces of Satan. Whether you pray or whether you actually go out there and get involved. But don't despair, because despair is what is going to destroy us all. It's simple as.
And I think it's a really good point, and it's something that I push very often on my podcast as well as doing. And tomorrow is the feast of Saint Joseph, who is the ultimate doer. He was. We don't know much about him. We just know that he did. He didn't complain, and I think that that's a really good point. That's more of what we need to do. And rather than talk and rather than spend all of our time complaining on social media and saying at the end of the world, I think that's such a good point. And I think that Catholics, there's something romantic about the end of the world, because we almost crave it in a way, because we know as traditional Catholics, our glory days in terms of the earth are gone, or not, maybe not forever, of course, Christ will return, but I mean, in our lifetimes, we've never had a pope, and we see no future of that. We see no future of a pope in a hierarchy, and that's hard. And so I think there's an instinct to think, well, that's not going to realistically happen. So hopefully the end of the world comes. I think that's really how people think. And
They
as you
do.
say, I think that is at least verging on a sin of against hope. And I think that we have to have faith in God that it will all come to a good conclusion. But that could be 100 years from now. It could be 1,000 years from now. And there were dark times in the past. And do you know how they got out of the dark times? Yes, obviously God, of course. But oftentimes it was through great saints. Look at Saint Catherine of Siena. Look at Saint in France. Look at Saint Joan of Arc, who she's a great example. Okay, in France, this wasn't in a world catastrophe, but France was in a bad spot. They were just been suffered. They'd lost 70% of their royalty in one battle. Everyone was dead. I think what was it? Maybe a couple decades before.
Avignon. Not Avignon, but Agincourt.
Agincourt, yeah. And she came up and led a country to defeat another technically Catholic country. And so again, it just shows you that action, and trying to do God's will, but through action rather than sitting and hiding our holes in the head, our head in the sand is the proper way to go. And I think that's really true. And it's really important, as you said too, that not everyone is meant to run for office. I mean, yes. But there's always a place. There's something you can do. And that's a good point.
And what I really love, what I think this movement is great too, is that there are, people do criticize, and some criticisms are valid. But as I say, the spirit of reform is constant. It is constant, and reform is constant. But I've seen so many young men who are going to be the future of really any society abandon vice and addiction just by seeing someone be strong in their politics and public life, and they're saying, wow, how is he like that? And then when they start digging into more about that leader or this person, they say, wow, it's because he is virtuous, it's because he abstains, it's because evils. I should do more like that. And so there is this draw in which the horse will get to the water through various different means. And I'm very happy to see that. It's something that I truly believe in, that God does use various means to get people to the faith and to even preserve a people. I lost the main part of what I was going to say there, but
no, I think that yeah, people. And now I lost my train of thought too, but the idea of
oh, I found it. If I may interject. Yeah, I'll find it. It was young men especially, and I'm going to start doing this in a week or two. We're forming a young men's group politically, and then within that group, we are forming a Catholic one. And the Catholic group is going to be very directed. It's going to be directed by myself. It's going to be a big responsibility with the help of some priests that you may know, and it's going to be very, very Catholic social values, and it's going to teach them on how they should interact with people outside their faith, how to bring people to us by good example, and by preaching our values eloquently and confidently. A lot of it's confidence. So that's what we're going to do. And then in the bigger group at large, it's going to be like sending these pods of young men into various parties and positions. So in a couple years, people will be like, well, how did so many good men get into power? They're not going to know how. It's because we really nurtured these young men and their values and their sentiments. So now it's like you have power in this area where you can start, flexing it and say, no, I don't want these books in our library. I don't want the parades of this type of degeneracy in our town. We don't want, 500,000 or, they wanted to fly in 5,000 Muslims into our area, which is strongly Catholic. And I won't touch too much on that, but you can know what kind of action or crime would happen as history can display to us. We could start saying, no, we have a religious and moral background here in the faith. We've been trained in learning the Constitution. We've been trained in learning these state apparatuses, especially the local ones. And we're strong Catholic men. There's no spirit of despair. The sky's the limit with God as your overlord and with, the Holy Ghost as your sole influence. And then you start using these real life means that God has given us, like certain people, certain leaders, trains of thought that are in perfect line with Catholic thinking. And then you zoom, you're able to just to clear the murky water. And I've seen that already with traditional Catholic young men and just young men who are coming to our way of thinking by the Holy Ghost's design, by his influence. They're actually able to clear aside some of that murk. You will be insulted a lot, but General Grant said, if you don't want criticism, don't do anything in life. So if you want to make a difference, expect criticism, expect pushback. But in reality, you're a man. You should be able to take this. We should all be able to take this. And a good struggle is good for us. It's good for us. It kind of keeps you limber.
And I think that another thing I've heard some people say, and this is pretty often, is the idea that we shouldn't get too involved in the world at all because we had to perfect ourselves as Catholics first. We had to perfect our family life and our homes. And again, don't get me wrong. I'm a father of one with a baby on the way. So of course that's number one. That is important. My faith is number one, not even a question. And then my family second. This is doesn't even need to be said, I think. Mm-hmm. But there is more. I think you can do all three. You can have faith, family, and if it's politics or a podcast. I mean, I spend a lot of time on a podcast, and this is trying to fight the cultural battle. I'm not going to try to fight the political battle, partly because I'm in Germany. It would be a little hard. But I mean, if that support is having you on a show, if it's having other people on the show to discuss these important topics, it takes time and it's hard, but it's worth it. And it's so important to say, I hope, I'm far from perfect, but it's not like I don't value or take time for the faith of my family because I do this. And I think that's really important to say, because I think that's really oftentimes what people say, you can't do this stuff because you have to perfect yourself first. And it's like, you're never going to perfect yourself. You're human.
You'll die. You'll die before you're perfect.
Of course. And so it's always a battle. And so the priorities, of course, are God and family. And then it can be politics, culture, etc. But don't just not do it because you think you have to perfect yourself first. And I just say that because I've heard many people make that comment, and I think it's a bit unfair.
It is, because I believe we should always try to be perfect, but what we gain in the pursuit of perfection is excellence. That is something we can achieve on this world. And I always give this advice to every young nationalist, whether they're Catholic or not, as I tell them to read the Soul of the Apostolate. It's meant for priests and religious, but it interprets so well with laymen, because it says, as a layman, you are giving a lot of yourself, but what are you actually keeping? What are you maintaining in your soul? Because it says, St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, we need more reservoirs of grace, not just channels. You need to be a reservoir and holding it within yourself. So that's why this internal devotion, the spiritual recollection internally, not just the public works, goes hand in hand with what we're doing. All of the great leaders of the Catholic world, laymen, that is, have been very devoted to God in their soul. They haven't just said, rah, rah, let's go out there. And and God too, I guess. We should believe in him. They didn't just do that. St. Ferdinand of Spain, Emperor Henry of the Holy Roman Empire, even Alfred the Great, St. Edward the Confessor, these were men that led, very holy lives. And so it is possible. And I think waiting for us to be perfect, like you said, is you're going to be a little long in the tooth, and in the true sense of that word, you will be old, and they'll be like, oh well, now that my life's vitality is gone, I guess I'm ready to go out there and be like, hello, fellow kids, welcome to politics. So I think the time is now, but you always have to remain 30 minutes of spiritual reading is what I try to maintain, morning, night prayers, or else you get lost because the world is so evil. It is so evil.
No, I think it's really true, and I think that I think we're going to have to save for another show. I think that we'll save the past of these issues, because I think that, I think it's more fitting for another time. I think that this show has been more about Catholic action, which is good. I think that's more of a current issue, and I think that it's a good issue. And I think we just spent a very easy hour speaking on it, and I think that that's important. So I guess I'd ask you one last question. I mean, you said you have these groups of young men you're trying to get together. Is that local where you are, or are you trying to spread that nationally or internationally? What's the plan for that?
Well, certainly not internationally, and logistically nationally not yet. And I'm just talking about these Catholics and local groups primarily. We already have the nationalist Catholic apparatus built, but for local action, we are doing it just in our little region. And so that's what we're doing it, because we need to have the leaders of these groups to give their full attention to them. Because the moment they become too big and too spread out, you start losing out on your original goal. You get spread too thin. That's why it's miraculous that the leaders of these certain nationalist movements, like America First, have been able to keep this core message so concrete. You either do it through a lot of charisma and intelligence, what I call a brain of ice and a heart of fire, or you do it on a smaller level. And on the smaller level, I'm Polish, so I kind of have to try a lot harder to do a little thinking. So you have to really put in effort. You got to put in more hands-on work and say, hey, let's meet at a certain point here. We're going to talk about the faith. We're going to have socially Catholic literature to read on history, on politics. And then we meet once a week, every 2 weeks. We have a little food, a little coffee. But my advice for bringing people to it is to have the charm of an ideal. There's so-called conservative boys groups and men's groups, young people's groups, like Turning Point USA and various so-called conservatives have, and they fail. Despite having all the money in the world, despite having so much media attention and no attacks from real dangerous people, they don't have the best and brightest, because there is no charm of an ideal. First of all, their ideals, they don't have any, and no charm at all. With smaller groups, the more passionate they are and the more eloquent they are, and the more smaller they are, that you won't have to rely on crutches such as like, oh, come to this party to learn politics. It'll be like, no, come to this meeting. We'll learn Catholic doctrine. We'll inflame your hearts with the Holy Ghost, and you'll be ready to be warriors for Christ in your locale, not just memeing about taking Jerusalem and Deus Vult all the time. You'll be able to go back to your locale and evangelize. That's what it's all about. It's not just about learning these totally banal platitudes that the whole conservative youth has become. As truly Catholics and as truly Catholic nationalists, you can have a charm of an ideal, and that's what all young men want, is that charm of an ideal. Something where it's like they're the underdogs, it's scrappy, they feel like it's something that is legit, not just some made-up farcical movement that is there for social interaction. It has to feel like a unit. It has to feel almost like a militaristic unit in its spirituality, like a society of Jesus for young men, the Jesuits. It can't be like the Knights of Columbus, how they've become. They watch Notre Dame football and eat pizza. Can't be like that. So,
I think that's well said. I mean, I think that I would ask you for last words, but I think those are pretty good ones. I mean, is there a way to support you, to contact you, to ask you questions? I'm sure people will have questions about this topic.
Mm,
I think again, I mean, I think you've done a good job of clarifying. I think that people
I think
will have a
so.
better idea of what you mean by this nationalist Catholic party. But people may have questions, so if they do, you want to give an email address or a website?
Yes. I believe when this goes online, when this goes on your channel, I will give you a link that you can post in the about section. I did that on my channel as well for you. It'll take you to a link of where you can find me on Telegram, Gab, which is a social media site like a less restrained Twitter, and also on I believe Instagram and YouTube. Those places we keep it lighthearted. It's a lot of just lighthearted content, not as Catholic as your podcast is, because it is more of a broader movement. I can't just be like, hey, convert or else. I sort of have to be very tailored without ever compromising. It's a tightrope that I'm still learning how to walk. But that's where you can find me. A link in the description, and feel free to reach out to me and get in contact, and that would be perfect.
Great. And so again, the Modern Monarchist, you can find him on YouTube. I do the Catholic Family Podcast again for the stream that's going over to his channel right now as well. If you enjoyed this show on either side, please like, share, subscribe, comment, all of that stuff. Share with your family and friends. We're both trying to do God's work and trying to always everything we do is for the greater glory of God. And I think that I get that feeling with you. I think that's the attempt. If everyone agrees or disagrees with our steps and our beliefs, I can't say, but I do think that we both have the best intentions. And if you would like to support either of us, please do so by liking, sharing, subscribing. I've got a Patreon I'll attach to this as well. If you'd like to support the channel, that's not to give me money for my life. It's literally just to support the streaming and the camera, etc. Yeah. So no worries. I have a job. I don't do this for my living. But no, I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed having you on. I think it's a really interesting discussion. There's so much we could have talked about this subject. We didn't even go really into the history of it at all, which is okay. Again, and I think that I'm sure we'll have some shows in the future, hopefully, if you're up for it. And
I am. Yeah.
until then, I've enjoyed it, and thanks for coming on. I know I've kind of put you through the ring last week. I was sick a couple of weeks ago when we were supposed to do this, so I apologize for that. But we finally made it on, and I'm glad we did it. And so until next time, when we talk about, maybe we'll talk about Mussolini next time. And until then, I appreciate it, and God bless.
God bless. Thank you, Kevin.